welcome to Matter Over Mind. This is a podcast that looks at things psychology and things physics, and it's a kind of a special episode today.
Yes,
hello, Thomas.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm very well.
Yeah, it's a special one. We're in the same room today.
In the same room.
Which is, unique to this podcast.
It's the first time we've done that. It's very exciting. We can actually look at each other as we're talking, and it feels a bit weird, actually, if I'm not...
A little bit, yeah. I'm used to looking at my other monitor.
Yeah. So we're visiting today, so that's why we're together. But we thought it was quite nice anyway, because it's our last episode of this season, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. Yes, the pair to the God episode, the physics one, will come out as a dyad alongside it. So to you folks, it'll appear as
well. We hope so.
Time,
it's
hopefully.
Now sort of 7:30 in the evening.
Yes.
It means I've got to finish the editing and get it out by tomorrow morning, so it might just be a wee bit late, but hopefully not too bad. So we're carrying on with this God topic, and the last one was about physics and God. So if you're interested in that, obviously catch that. If you're not, why not? Because it's really interesting. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was good. It was interesting to hear up some of the reasonably good arguments, to be fair. In my looking into it, I was actually... They weren't as wooey as I thought they may be. Which is always nice.
Okay, so check that out if you've not done that already. But today we're going to look at it from the psychological aspect. So I've got a few topics I'm hoping to get through today. I've kind of got 4 areas that I wanted to cover.
Okay.
One is around evolutionary psychology. So I suppose that what we're trying to do is understand, why do so many of us believe in God? Evolutionary psychology might give us some clue to that. There's something around also kind of the physiology of God, so is it hardwired into our brain sort of thing? So I think that's kind of, we compare that with evolution and the physical nature of our brains. There's a bit I want to talk about around attachment theory, because it's an area that is of great interest to me.
Okay.
So we can get into that. And also something I've talked about on other podcasts, this idea of magical thinking. So I think that's closely allied to the idea of God and what it is about humans that we tend to have this magical thinking. What is it, and all of that sort of stuff. So we can talk a little bit about that. And also, I said 4, but it feels like there's more than 4 now. But there's the question of, is it good for you or is it not?
Yes.
So is psychologically, is it good for you to have a religious belief or belief in God? If not, okay, why not? If it is, then why is it? And shades of grey around there.
Cool.
So I thought I'd perhaps start off with the physical side of God, and I stumbled across quite an interesting I've seen this experiment before, but it kind of hints at an actual physiological place, if you like, where this idea about God might reside.
Okay.
There's a network in the brain called the default mode network, or the DMN.
Right.
And this is in different parts of the brain. It's a network, so it goes into different lobes of the brain.
Okay.
But it's associated with the self, really. So it's when we're doing what's called self-referential thought, so when we're thinking about ourselves. When we're meditating, it's very powerful there. So people who meditate seem to use that network quite a lot, and more than other people. It's to do with our autobiographical memory. So the memories that, remember we talked about the self, what is that? And I said it's essentially a story. And it's in this network. If we talk about the physical brain, then it's in this network that story really is told. So it's this autobiographical memory, things that have happened to us and how we make sense of that in relation to ourselves. It's also linked to theory of mind. So that's the the ability that we have and other higher primates and probably other mammals have to recognise that other creatures have minds.
Okay.
So theory of mind is not the theory of our mind, but it's the theory that
Oh,
other
right.
creatures have minds.
Okay, so like the opposite of solipsism, I suppose.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Big tick there. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a really interesting one. So that's also associated with it, and it's also associated with things like daydreaming and mind wandering when you're in kind of like I suppose there's like a semi-hypnotic state. We go into those states normally, and that's when that area tends to activate, or that network tends to activate. And so I think, if you think about religious experiences, spiritual perhaps experiences, not just about religion, but experiences where you might feel like you're at one with God, or that you're talking to God, or that God is with you, or other spiritual experiences where people talk about feelings of oneness with some place that they visited, Stonehenge or the pyramids or something like that, where people have these deep feelings. It's kind of all related to these areas, really. So,
Okay.
and also the theory of mind, it gives you the ability to be able to imagine another mind.
Okay.
Without that, you're never going to have a
Well,
belief in God, are you?
yeah, for sure. So is this, I guess, why when you hear people talk about what suppose they weren't religious and then what made them believe, there's always this, this personal experience. It actually came to me in this instance, or this thing happened, therefore. I guess it's that, right?
Yeah, and it's for some people it's incredibly powerful. I have to say I've never had that experience personally. The closest I think I've come to it is when I'm in nature and it's really, really peaceful. Definitely no phones, no electronics, and you just suddenly start to become hyper aware of the wind on your face and the breeze and the smell of the flowers and the sounds of the. It's not quiet, is it? You hear all sorts of sounds. And I think there's moments there where you sort of, I felt a deep connection, but I'm not sure it's. What about you? Have you ever experienced that sort of thing?
I don't really know. Well, when you're saying, I was trying to think up a scenario, but I don't really. I mean, when I'm out and when I'm in a nice place, I do acknowledge it's nice. But I don't really know if I've had such a strong feeling as that, or at least none that come to mind immediately. Anyway, maybe I have at some point, but
I think we're both of us are quite analytical people, and maybe someday, if we ever get guests, maybe we get somebody in to talk about experiences like that, because we probably never had them really.
No, I'm trying to.
Made of stone.
It's kind of like when someone's like, well, imagine this thing, or like you're saying on the other episode, trying to think up a new colour. You can't. I don't know. You can't. I can't think of being moved by a place in the same way. That, I mean, maybe it's the descriptors. Maybe the way people describe it, I don't really get what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So it's hard to link that the two are the same.
Yeah, and the fact that everything has to be translated into words, in a way that it could just be that there are no words for that experience. So, but anyway, that's all associated with this network.
Okay.
The other thing that is a physiological effect that I've sort of stumbled across, which, well, I didn't stumble across it actually because I'd remembered it from a documentary I'd watched years ago, and so I looked it up, and there's this guy called Michael Persinger.
Okay.
Who did a series of experiments. I think he was Canadian. Did a series of experiments with electromagnetic fields around people's brain.
Okay.
Very weak fields, so he wasn't like frying anybody's brain. But it's very weak fields, but they're very targeted at certain parts of the brain.
Okay.
And particularly the right temporal lobe, for some reason, there's an area there that he focuses on. and he's got this hat, this helmet.
Okay.
So people put this helmet on.
Yeah.
They sit in this chair. They put a helmet on, and he then does these electrical fields, and they report feeling a presence in the room.
Okay.
Multiple presences, actually. There was this young woman. She talked about what she'd seen or felt. Actually, not seen but felt. She felt that there were beings in the room.
Okay.
And he said to her, how many? And she then started to point at them, counting them. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Okay, so your brain obviously has an associated magnetic field
Yeah.
with it because you have electrical currents, as I've talked about on the physics episode a bunch, how those two are related. And then so he puts on a helmet that I'm guessing also emits some kind of magnetic field.
Yeah.
And then because of how magnetic fields interact, it basically adds to the field strength of the brain or detracts away. So directly interacting with the brain's currents, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, that would make sense. That
Yeah.
you would probably experience something unique.
Yeah. So they also interviewed Susan Blackmore. So Susan Blackmore she's kind of quite well known in psychology and neuroscience, really.
Mm-hmm.
But she's written a few books. I've got some of her books. But she actually, for a BBC television programme, she actually went and did this.
Yeah.
And so there's a little interview on YouTube. I'll put the link on the show notes and certainly on our Facebook page. And she talked about it and she said it's the strangest experience she's ever had. Absolutely the weirdest thing she's ever experienced. And she said, I've experienced a lot of strange stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. 'Cause I guess it's like, in a way, what you're essentially doing to the circuitry in your brain, you're just adding in, or either adding in resistance. So like a circuit, you've got a resistor, it can like decrease the current. You're basically doing that, but in your brain, right? So you're messing with the circuit speed, I guess, or the amount of current transmitted from node A to node B. So yeah, that's weird. That's interesting.
It is. It doesn't really prove or disprove God. You know, so I don't think it's a threat to anybody's beliefs, but it I mean, it suggests that there is a possibility that it is a physiological sort of side effect, really, from all the stuff that's going on. You know, it's a complex machine.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. It's electrochemical. There's electrical signals going on. We have different rhythms in the brain, you know, alpha, beta, and all of that. So that can easily be disturbed. Electrical fields might be able to do that. So yeah, and the suggestion that things like alien abduction stories, things like that, could be partly related to something like that happening naturally. So I think that's quite interesting. It's quite an interesting phenomena. So I think it's possible that our beliefs in God or spirituality stem from actual physical things that are going on in the brain.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to remember. I think the other one that I'd perhaps like to get into fairly quickly is the evolutionary origins of it.
Yeah.
So evolutionary psychology is a bit controversial, really. I did it as part of my degree. But even then, you know, we had to talk about the criticisms for it, because there are criticisms. And I was trying to remember, there was a guy on TV in the UK, and I couldn't remember his name, and all of a sudden it popped into my mind, and I looked him up, and there he was, Desmond Morris.
Okay.
So if you're of a certain age, like my age, and probably in the UK, you might remember Desmond Morris, and he did a BBC TV programme and wrote a book called The Naked Ape.
Okay.
And it was really all about how a lot of our behaviour can be seen as evolutionary. You know?
Yeah.
So this is why we do these things. This is why we do those things. And religion could be one of those things, one of those behaviours that we have because it's been selected for.
Yeah.
So to avoid me just talking all the way through this, I'd like to get your thoughts on what do you think? Do you think that our belief in God could have an evolutionary benefit that became selected for?
Maybe. I mean, you've mentioned before about inherited memories from, you know, from I guess evolutionary behaviors, but memory wise, right? And not maybe not memories was the word you
So we
used,
talked
but-
about Jung, didn't we? And these Jungian archetypes he talked about.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we do have not memories in the sense, or at least we don't think we inherit memories,
behaviours,
but
wasn't it?
behaviours.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
instincts.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess if you go back far enough to the, I mean, you can understand why, you know, someone in the, I don't know, the year 400 might think that a god exists. Like they don't understand what lightning is, for example,
Yeah.
or how volcanoes work or anything like that. So you can understand the logic behind a greater being causing this stuff because they didn't sacrifice enough goats or whatever.
Yeah.
And you think, how long must have people thought of a higher power because of exactly these phenomena? I mean, that must be always, right?
Yeah.
To the point where we actually started to understand that stuff realistically a couple hundred years ago, or, you know, maybe half a thousand years, possibly. I don't know when we discovered what lightning was, but humans have probably existed fearing stuff like natural disasters for far longer than we've understood them.
Of course.
And if you assume that that's a god, then maybe it is this sort of inherited behaviours or learned behaviours that are kind of coming in there.
So if that was the case, then you would have to subscribe to the idea that you could have complex ideas like God that somehow could be encoded as memories.
Maybe not complex as like a fully fleshed out, as we have, you know, modern day Christianity. But I mean, religions, I mean, we don't have a pantheon of gods anymore, for example, at least in Christian countries. But there has been I guess if you look at the Greeks, each god had a different thing that they were the god of, right? And then I guess now it's Christianity. There is just one, right? Well, I'm not too savvy about other religions, but so it's almost like it's been kind of fine tuned. But yeah, I mean, yeah. So again, not being a psychologist, I don't really know.
I'm kind of putting you on the spot there. But I think what you're describing is more of a Jungian idea, actually, because if we go back to our very first episode on the psychology one, which was about archetypes, Jung believed that we did have this ancient set of memories, these very, very ancient sorts of concepts that express themselves differently. So it's not like we all have exactly the same archetype, but the same sorts of archetypes expressed in similar ways, like the creator, like the mother figure, like the trickster. And a lot of religions do incorporate these sorts of characters, the hero, the person that sacrifices themselves. And so that I think what you described, a Jungian psychologist would recognise that. I think they would accept that. But I think if you're looking at it as an evolutionary basis, then you're talking more about what advantage would a belief in God or a spiritual side of life, what advantage would that give individuals so that they were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce?
Okay.
So that's if we're talking about traditional sort of down the line Darwinian evolution, we're saying that the selection process is really where natural selection is really where traits that are beneficial get selected for, and traits that are not beneficial, or worse still, you know, deficient to survival, that those get selected out. So individuals like, I don't know, having a slightly longer neck or a slightly longer arm or running slightly faster, they're more likely to survive long enough to procreate and then reproduce, and that's more likely to pass on that gene or that combination of genes that produces that trait. And so that's how you end up with certain physical traits being selected for. So the question is, does that happen with psychological traits which leads to behaviour? And I think there's a lot of good evidence for that, which is why we have the fight or flight response, for instance.
Okay.
So we're born with that.
Yeah.
We're born with that because if you were a primitive ape-like creature, you know, pottering around, mind your own business, and you heard a rustle in the bushes, if you thought, yeah, it'd be all right, I don't worry about that, sounds nothing to worry about there, then you're more likely to get eaten, which means you're less likely to survive and reproduce.
Makes sense.
So evolutionarily, if that is a word, we are selected for the likelihood that we are scared of stuff.
Yeah.
And we run away or we come out fighting.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. That's slightly changed then my my answer a little bit to your question.
So could a belief in God imbue upon an individual a greater chance of survival?
The one that comes to mind, I guess, is the congregation. I guess, right? You know, you have these sort of
social
parishes or whatever that all kind of group together under, you know, around a church or whatever, and then that's their little congregation. So basically, it's sticking with the pack, right?
That's it. Yeah.
You've got a sole focus that everybody is in agreement. This is the thing that we follow, therefore we stick together.
Yeah.
So that's the big one that I can think would have an evolutionary benefit to.
Yeah. I think that's the strongest one in many ways. We looked at kin relationships. So that, you know, one of the reasons why perhaps we have this in-group, out-group mentality is that it's evolved through through kin selection, if you like. So in other words, close relatives, if you think about it like the selfish gene sort of hypothesis, that you want to keep your genes going forward, then your close relatives have more of your genes than anybody else, therefore you will protect them and you will stick with them.
Yeah.
So if you think about it in those terms, and that's one way of thinking about it. So yeah, social behaviour, it makes people stick together, the tribe, the social group, and religion can help solidify that, can't it?
Yeah.
So we're all part of the same religion. We all believe in the same God. We all do the same traditions. You know, whatever those might be, it doesn't really matter what they are. Whether it's singing around a fire or marching somewhere or you know, sacrificing a goat, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I suppose it does to the goat. But it doesn't really matter. It's just that we're doing it together. So I think that's quite a powerful one in a way, because that is one of the, I think, sort of modern day criticisms of atheism, let's say, or non-belief, is that we lack that if we're not a believer. So we lack those opportunities to get together, to sing together, to worship together, the traditions of things like you know, coming of age sorts of ceremonies, those sorts of things that we used to do that we don't do anymore. So I think it's quite an interesting one, that. So that could be a reason for religion. It could be that psychologically we have evolved to have a belief in God or a belief in spirituality because it's part of what keeps us together. So I think it's quite an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah. There's other ones around evolution. I mean, we could talk about attachment theory, which sits quite nicely actually within that. So attachment theory is a theory developed by Bowlby. His name was John Bowlby, but the one that I remember most is Mary Ainsworth, who came up with this strange situation experiment, she called it. Have you ever come across that before?
No.
So basically the theory goes that when we are a child, we form an attachment to our significant caregiver.
Okay.
And the nature of that attachment is quite important. It can be secure as an attachment, which means that we feel this is as a child, although we do talk about adult attachment as well, but the original thing was around children and child attachment. So as we start to develop sort of toddler age, we see the parents or whoever it is that's looking after us as the attachment figure. If we have, and so what Bowlby and Ainsworth did, they classified these attachments, and they talked about 3/4 different types of attachment. One was called a secure attachment, which is where you trust that the caregiver is always going to be there for you. You know you can go back to them. And you go away, but you come back and they're still there. You hurt yourself and they're there. But they're not smothering you. But you kind of got a nice, elastic sort of relationship there. And as you get older, you need less and less of that constant nurturing. But you still have it there if you want it. And that can form how you sort of see relationships later on in life. And there's another type of attachment. It's called anxious attachment, and that's when it's often when you've got a parent or a close attachment figure that isn't really paying much attention to you, so the child starts to get anxious, or it could be that they're not sure that you'll be there. So you kind of, and that can have an effect. None of these things, by the way, are, although it can have an effect on you later in life, you can overcome these things. I think it's important to just mention that. But an anxious attachment means that as a child you may sort of be anxious when you're away from that caregiver. And then there's the avoidant type of attachment, which is that you don't want to get close at all. You want to pretend that you don't care. So that's like, I don't care about you. Whether you do or not, that's a different question, but that's the avoidant attachment. And then there's the other one, which is called the disorganized attachment, which is where you don't quite know where you stand with that close caregiver. So you kind of, one minute they might be really loving, the next minute they're telling you off, and you don't understand why. Sometimes they're really threatening, sometimes they're not, but they're the only source of comfort you've got. So you kind of keep going back to them, but at the same time you're scared of them because they keep surprising you and that you don't know where you stand with them. And that's the worst type. So the other three, they're all called organised. Secure is the best. Anxious or avoidant, that can make life growing up a bit difficult, but you can overcome it. But the worst one is disorganised, because it kind of traumatises you. So if a parent is very abusive, it can make it very difficult for the child. So that's a very brief description of attachment theory. I know it's a bit lengthy, but that's the best I could do. What Mary Ainsworth did, she came up with an experiment called the strange experience, I think it's called. The strange situation. And the experiment went like, she had, it was normally the mother. The mother would be in a room with a child. Child would have some crayons, doing some drawing or reading books or playing with toys and stuff. And then a stranger would come into the room, and the mother would talk to the stranger for a little bit, and then the mother would leave the room. So these are toddlers, really. And what was interesting wasn't so much how the child behaved when the mother had gone, but it was how the child behaved when the mother came back. And on the basis of the behaviour of the child, she analysed that, and she decided whether there was a secure attachment there or whether it was insecure or anxious or avoidant. And the behaviour would range from, just going back to mum, just seeing if everything's okay, and then just carrying on playing. Or maybe the child didn't look at the mother at all anymore. So kind of avoidant. Or it was so clingy now, because it was scared to death that she'd go away again. So it was anxious. So that was how she... And then there was this other type that sort of emerged later, which was they couldn't quite understand what was going on. The child was confused about how to respond.
And so this was specifically because an arbitrary stranger came in and chatted.
Well, that was the trigger.
Okay.
That was a trigger in terms of it was an unusual situation, a strange situation for the child. That's why it's called that.
Mm-hmm.
And the question, so the stranger didn't do anything. It wasn't, they were the same, and they did the same every time they came in. Just chatted to the mum. Mum went out, and then she was just there. The stranger was always a woman. They didn't really interact with the child.
Oh, so the stranger stayed in the room.
Stranger stayed in the room.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have mentioned.
Yeah.
Stranger stayed in the room, and the mother left.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't leave it till the child started.
Yeah.
Being incredibly afraid or anything like that. I still think it would struggle to get through ethics these days, if I'm honest. Yeah. But you can observe some of these. There's some examples on YouTube from the original experiments that she carried out.
Yeah.
And there's nothing horrific there. But it is. I suppose I'd find it uncomfortable if I was the
stranger.
The stranger or the researcher, really. I'm not sure I'd want to put kids in that situation now. But anyway, that's what they did. So how did the child respond when the mum came back into the room? That was the question. And on the basis of that, she could decide what sort of attachment the child had.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, if there was a problem there, then they could talk to the mother and say, look, we can help you. I don't know whether they did that or not, or they just said, thanks very much. Here's your £5 for taking part. So anyway, what I'm getting to here, I know it's a long old slog, but there's some work, and it's something that I've thought about a heck of a lot, actually, around God being the attachment figure.
Right, okay. Yeah.
So if you take that model and say that God essentially forms the same sort of model that you've had for your caregiver, you essentially use that as a model and you apply it then to, especially as you get older, but also when you're a kid, you might apply that to, the kind of greater attachment figure, the greatest attachment figure of all, God. And that's the way that God is framed, certainly to us in the UK and in sort of Christian countries, that God is this kind of father figure.
Yeah.
And somebody to whom you should be attached. And that's why, so the reason I think this is really interesting is because so many times when I did my research in psychology, I'd read the first line of a piece of research was, we know that religion is associated with better mental health states.
Okay.
And I always read that and I thought, do we?
Yeah, that's quite a loaded statement. Yeah. I'd feel uncomfortable making such a definitive statement. Yeah.
And normally it comes with some references.
Yeah.
So if you look at those references, I'm not satisfied with those.
Okay.
I think a lot of them are questionnaires, and if you ask people of faith about the benefits or how they feel about God and how they feel about their faith and so on, of course they're going to talk about the benefits, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a bit of a biased group. It's not
obviously I've not looked at all the questions, but I just feel like it's one of those areas where I'm very suspicious of questionnaire type research personally. So I'm not sure about that, but it could be. What I suggest is that if your attachment with God is a secure attachment, then I would suggest that you're in a pretty good place. Yeah. This has got nothing to do with whether God actually exists or not. But psychologically, if the God that is in your mind is a God that is like this secure attachment where you can go off and do your life but you know that God is always there. You can always go back to him or her, however you want to personify God or not, but you feel like you've always got that that great creator to go back to. I think that must feel pretty good.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I suppose the people answering the questionnaires are probably quite happy with that.
Yeah.
But so okay, so that's the good case. You've won the good God lottery. What if, I suppose, you have the anxious or the more complex one, or I guess this probably falls in if you're, I guess, for fearful, if it's a vengeful God that you worship.
That's very insightful, because I really feel that is the case for certainly the God that I was taught was, as far as I'm concerned, a kind of coercive, controlling God. Now, I'm not saying this is the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
People have their own interpretation of the God that they worship, and if they believe the Bible and so on, fine. But the God that was constructed for me was a very confusing God. 1 minute he was loving and kind, slow to anger, merciful, abundant in loving kindness. And we were told to love God because God is love. He's so, he is love. He's so gentle and kind, and there's all these beautiful poetic ways of describing God. But on the other hand, you'd then find that he would slaughter whole nations, including the children and the babies and the animals. Do not allow any creature to live, and they'd all be put to the sword. And these were instructions that God gave to his people to literally carry out genocide, so that none of these can ever again survive. That's pretty scary as a child. You think that's not very nice. I don't like that. And then there was other concepts like sinning against the Holy Spirit, which is unforgivable. If you put in a child's mind, there is a type of sin that is unforgivable. Oh no, I might have done that. So the God that I was taught about, and I spoke about this in the other episode, was a God that was actually terrifying. It was like an abusive relationship, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who was raised as my religion was Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm not saying that everyone who's raised like that has that image of God, but that's the way it came to me through my own psychology. And so I found that God really confusing. So I think when you come to say something like, is it good for you? Is a belief in God psychologically good for you? It depends.
Yeah. Well,
doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, I suppose you could say, is it better to have a caregiver than not? Yeah. So, okay, fine. But you'd still want to say, but it's not a blanket, it doesn't kind of matter what sort of caregiver you have. So I think the same goes for God. There's a researcher called Alexandra Stein that we've interviewed in a previous podcast called Cult Hackers. So if you're interested in listening to her talk about her book, then you can catch that on that podcast. But she uses attachment theory to describe cultic groups. But she's more talking about the leader of the cult being that attachment figure.
Yeah.
So they set up that coercive relationship. And I put to her, because when I read her book, I thought, I get that, but I actually think it was the God that they created that was the abusive figure in that, rather than the cult leaders. Because we didn't know those leaders. We didn't have anything to do with them. So they had no part in my upbringing. But it was actually the God that was constructed by the religion that was the thing. So I think that's quite an interesting one, and it brings us back to evolutionary questions. So if we go back to whether evolution has a part to play in belief in God, you could say that, again, mentally healthy people are more likely to survive and thrive. And maybe it could be that this attachment is something that is helpful for people if it's a positive one, if it's an organised and supportive and secure attachment, maybe that is good for us. But again, you can't say across the board because it depends on the type of relationship.
Just a quick note on this. So, in terms of the evolutionary point of view, I mean, there have definitely been in history not great leaders. But suppose you're in a bit of a tribal system. Your leader is a bit of a dictator, kind of fly off the handle kind of character. But if you kind of put up with, their abuse, you will still get food or security or whatever. Well, I guess this is kind of like the attachment, one of the attachments that you mentioned earlier. But yeah, so it's the risk of leaving the tribe or leaving the town or whatever is the fear of leaving is greater than, I guess, what you're going to get. Because the end result is, you get dictated, but you do get your food or your hut or whatever. So could that have anything to do with?
Yeah, so that's extending. So I think attachment theory is really useful for modelling those close relationships that are based around a kind of parent or caregiver to child relationship that then forms a model or a schema of what those sorts of close relationships could be later in life. And that would include a belief in God.
Yeah.
So I think for that really works. I don't think it's the be all and end all for all relationship type questions. And if we look at things like coercive control within a relationship or a nation or a cultic group or a business that's a kind of coercively controlling business, there's a few tactics that they employ for that. I think that's part of it, because often the leader is seen as a kind of father figure. Like we're watching Severance, aren't we? Which is our favourite thing at the moment. We've just finished the second season, and Kia, who is the leader of the group, obviously he's dead by the time or at least we think he is. Who knows what comes? But we think he's dead because he's old. But there's statues of him, and he's kind of talked about as a father, isn't he?
Yeah. Well, he's their leader, because the Egan's, the current, I guess, CEOs of the company, kind of, he's like the ultimate measuring rod, right?
Yeah.
He's the thing to aspire to. Yeah. And you need to be an Egan. You need to show the what's the word? You need to behave somewhat like him.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You need to emulate him, but he is drawing on the father figure of Keir, I would suggest. So I think Keir is put up there as the father figure, to whom we all kind of it's not put as worship, but it's this warm. Again, I think there's an attachment element there.
Yeah.
But there's also other methods are deployed, like you mentioned the one, really, or you alluded to the fact that if you're put outside the tribe, that's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
So fear of being isolated, fear of being cast out of the group is a big lever that abusive leaders will have over their followers or the tribe. So the fear of being shunned or being cast out is a very natural one, and I think that's another part of our evolved sensibilities. We try and do anything to avoid being socially shunned in that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's another big one. And then there's very simple fears around getting beaten, or fears about getting killed or executed, or yeah, all of those things.
Mm.
I would suggest we are living in an age, I think, in history, if you look back at history, you look at the kings and queens of England, let's say, our country, and you read how people behaved around them. It was a very cultic sort of arrangement, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I would suggest that dynamic has probably been more common than not.
Yeah.
In families, in religions, in authority, and probably the idea of individualism and ability to make our own decisions and those sorts of things is relatively new. And I fear that that's waning because of the sort of extreme political movements that we are currently seeing.
Yeah.
And I personally think Trump's an example of that. And the way that not necessarily everybody voted for him, but there's a kind of hardcore of people who it's almost like they cannot now accept anything bad about him because they are completely, they're hook, line and sinker. They're in.
Yeah.
Like they can't risk leaving. They can't risk losing that because they're now attached to this figure. So I think it's still there. It's part of our psychology.
Are there any other psychology god?
Any other psychology god stuff? So I suppose the final one is related to this. It is, and I think you've already mentioned it. Actually, is that probably the simplest way of explaining God, apart from if you believe that God exists. That's I suppose a simpler one still. But I think what you said earlier is absolutely right. That if we imagine a world of people, human beings, primitive human beings, apes essentially. Nobody gave a lesson to our ancestors about what was going on. So we saw frightening things like thunderstorms and wild animals would attack, and there'd be hurricanes and earthquakes, and people just die of young, old, but they would all die. And in a way, that's one of the biggest, most horrific things that nature has done for us. It's given us, as human beings, we have the intelligence to understand that we're alive, but that we'll also die.
Yeah.
And we don't know what that is.
Yeah.
We don't know how to think about that. We don't know how to understand that. Along with all the other complicated, hard to understand stuff that's going on that we could never have understood it thousands of years ago. How do you explain that? How do you make sense of that world, of all that stuff, and that you're going to die one day? Because everybody does. I mean, the idea of a God that you can go back to, or that there's a life afterwards. No wonder we develop those sorts of ideas. And they take different forms. For some religions that is literally living somewhere else, like we are now. For others it's about going back into nature or becoming part of nature, but whatever it is, it's a way to try and explain this complicated, confusing, frightening existence, and the knowledge that it's going to end one day. And it is a very unsettling idea. No wonder that we develop this greater power to explain that.
Yeah, I mean, that's I can't argue with that.
That's kind of a drop mic moment, isn't it? Let's leave it there. I think that is the most logical reason for religion and faith and God. That's my view. Whether it's good for you or not, I think for some it can be, and maybe if you've got this lovely secure attachment with a God figure, whether that God is literally real or not, is a different question. But that's my musings on God.
There we are. Yeah, sounds good.
Right. Okay. Well, I've enjoyed that, and I want to say thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you for our 12 episodes that we've done.
6 dyads. Yeah.
6 dyads. We have to decide whether we're going to carry on with the dyads next time. We really enjoyed doing it. We're building up a small following, but a following nonetheless. So please continue to check us out. Give us ideas for the sorts of topics you'd like us to cover. Thomas, you gave me a list of things that you want to go through. We'd have to talk to them now, but just so you know, listeners,
we have ideas.
We've got a list.
Yeah.
So we thought about doing the odd bonus episodes in between seasons. We're not quite sure when the next season will be. You're going to be quite busy the next few months.
Yes.
Thomas.
Yes, indeed.
So after that, we'll get together again, and so we hope to see you again soon. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to tell people about the podcast. You can still listen. It'll all be up there, even during our holiday period. See you again soon.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.